Hey guys. Tonight we're going to journey back to one of the darkest periods in history, when death lurked in every corner, and fear gripped the hearts of millions. We're talking about the rise of flagellant cults during the Plague, an eerie chapter in medieval Europe where the lines between devotion, desperation, and madness blurred. Picture this: a world ravaged by disease, where people were desperate for answers, and in their despair, something strange and disturbing began to rise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from. So, drop your location and time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the mid-14th century, Europe found itself in the grip of the Black Death, a plague so deadly that it wiped out nearly half the population of the continent. The disease spread like wildfire, taking with it lives from every corner of society, rich and poor, young and old. With no knowledge of germs or viruses, people were left to speculate on the cause of the disease. Was it divine punishment, a curse for humanity's sins, or something far more sinister? In this atmosphere of fear, confusion, and grief, a movement began to rise. It was not one of hope, but of pain and self-inflicted suffering. These were the flagellants, groups of people who believed that the way to stop the plague was through extreme penance. They would gather into large groups, stripping off their clothes and whipping themselves with scourges, chanting prayers for salvation and seeking to appease the wrath of God. They thought by causing themselves pain, they would somehow earn God's forgiveness for the sins of humanity. Can you imagine the sight? Men and women, battered and bruised, walking through the streets of cities, lashing their bodies with whips in a desperate attempt to stop the plague. This was a time when the world was losing hope, and the flagellants became a symbol of that hopelessness. They were convinced that only through their suffering could the wrath of God be softened. The flagellants weren't a single, organized group. They were scattered all across Europe, popping up wherever the plague struck hardest. And what's even more disturbing is how quickly they gained followers. The masses, terrified by the plague and desperate for answers, flocked to these groups, believing that self-inflicted suffering could bring salvation. Their movements grew with alarming speed, and soon, entire towns were filled with the sound of flagellants whipping their backs, chanting prayers to the heavens. But what made the flagellant movement particularly disturbing wasn't just the acts of penance. It was the sheer fervor with which people participated. These were not small, quiet rituals. They were public spectacles in some cities. The flagellants would march through the streets in large, organized processions, attracting thousands of people. As they marched, they would whip themselves into a frenzy, crying out for mercy, their backs bloodied from the harsh lashes. The pain was part of the ritual. It was believed that through this suffering, they could purify themselves and the world around them. As their numbers grew, so did the intensity of their actions. The flagellants didn't just view their own suffering as a form of penance. They saw it as a form of public protest against the perceived corruption of society. They believed that their actions were necessary to rid the world of the plague, and anyone who refused to join them was seen as complicit in the sin that had brought the disease to the world. But the rise of these cults wasn't just an organic, spiritual response to the plague. It also created a significant challenge to the existing religious authority. The Catholic Church, which had long held sway over the people of Europe, found itself at odds with the flagellants. While the Church promoted repentance and prayer, it did not endorse such extreme measures. To the Church, the flagellants were dangerously unorthodox, and their actions were seen as a challenge to the authority of the clergy. The Church's response was swift. Initially, they tried to ignore the movement, hoping it would die down on its own. But when the flagellants continued to grow in numbers and began to attract the attention of the masses, The church had no choice but to intervene. The Pope at the time, Clement VI, condemned the flagellant movement, calling it heretical and declaring that it was not through self-inflicted suffering that the plague could be ended. But through God's mercy, the church's condemnation had little effect on the flagellants, who believed they were following a divine calling. In fact, their defiance against the church only made their movement more attractive to those who felt disconnected from the institutional power of the clergy. To the flagellants, the church had become part of the problem. The plague, they believed, was a result of humanity's sin, and the clergy, with all their wealth and power, were just as guilty as anyone else. This tension between the flagellants and the church eventually led to violent confrontations. The flagellants became a source of public disorder, attracting both admiration and anger in equal measure. The church, fearing the rise of this rebellious force, began to suppress the movement more aggressively in some regions. Local authorities were ordered to arrest flagellants, and brutal crackdowns ensued. Yet, despite this, the flagellant cults continued to exist for several years, leaving behind a trail of bloodshed, anger, and fear as the years went on. The flagellant movements eventually faded, but the effects of their rise during the Black Death continued to linger. The image of men and women whipping themselves in the streets, crying out for redemption, became a haunting symbol of the terror and confusion that gripped Europe during one of its darkest times. And though the movements themselves eventually diminished, they left behind a powerful cultural and religious legacy. The idea that suffering could bring salvation took root in the minds of many, influencing not just religious movements but also popular culture for generations to come. As we continue our journey into the disturbing rise of flagellant cults during the plague, let's take a closer look at how the legacy of these extreme movements impacted not only the religious landscape but also the social and political structure of medieval Europe. The Black Death, with its incomprehensible speed and devastating death toll, left Europe in a state of shock. Entire communities were wiped out in a matter of weeks, and people were grasping at any explanation for the destruction they faced in this atmosphere of fear and confusion. The flagellant movements flourished. The streets were filled with these self-flagellating cults, each group marching with fervor and determination, convinced that their actions would appease God and end the plague. But the true horror was that their actions were not just about penance, they were deeply political and social. The flagellants, in their desperate desire to cleanse the world of its sins, began to challenge the very fabric of society. The flagellants became a movement that transcended religious orthodoxy as they marched through the streets, whipping themselves into bloody frenzy. They attracted not just the religiously devoted, but also those who felt disillusioned with the church and the social order. The medieval Catholic Church was powerful, but its wealth, its politics, and its perceived corruption had already started to alienate many to the flagellants. The church was part of the system that allowed sin to flourish, and they believed they could purify the world without its help. This growing disillusionment with the church's role in society fueled the flagellant movement. People who had lost faith in traditional institutions saw the flagellants as a radical force for change. Some saw them as martyrs, others as dangerous rebels. But their message was clear: the time of repentance was over. Now was the time for action. They believed that it was through their suffering, their visible and painful demonstrations of devotion, that they would save the world from God's wrath. The flagellant processions became more than just religious rituals, they became political acts. In many towns, the flagellants were seen as a challenge to the established order. They marched through the streets, often in large numbers, demanding repentance from everyone in their path. They did not just isolate themselves, they sought to change the world around them. In some cities, they even gained support from local rulers who saw them as a force of religious reform, even as the church itself sought to suppress them. As these processions grew in number, they began to provoke violent clashes with local authorities. The church, particularly Pope Clement VI, was horrified by the public spectacle and the challenge to its authority. The Pope issued a formal decree condemning the Flagellant movement in 1349, but by then, the movement had already gained considerable momentum for many people, especially the poor and the desperate. The Flagellants offered a form of solace and purpose that the Church had failed to provide. The Pope's condemnation only added fuel to the fire, as it reinforced the perception that the Church was corrupt and out of touch with the suffering of the people in cities across Europe. The Flagellants' power grew. They took to the streets, marching in massive organized groups, often accompanied by music and chanting, creating an unsettling and almost hypnotic atmosphere. Their practice of self-flagellation was not just an act of personal penance, it became a communal event. These groups would whip themselves in unison, in time to their chants, with blood staining their bodies as they paraded through towns. It wasn't just about personal suffering, it was about showing the world how much pain they were willing to endure for the salvation of all. But as much as the Flagellants were a symbol of devoutness and sacrifice, they were also a source of terror for many, for the ruling classes and the clergy. The Flagellants posed a significant threat. They represented an uprising, a challenge to the established powers, both religious and secular. The intensity of their belief in their mission made them a force to be reckoned with, and many feared their growing influence. The Flagellant movement began to wane after the papal condemnation, and the Church's efforts to suppress it were effective in the long term. However, the movement's influence did not disappear entirely, even as the groups were outlawed and persecuted. The image of the self-flagellating pilgrim, bloodied and bent on salvation, persisted. The idea that suffering could redeem sins became ingrained in European culture, and echoes of the flagellant cults can be seen in later religious movements, as well as in the more extreme forms of religious practice. Their impact on the cultural and religious landscape of Europe cannot be underestimated, while they may have faded away. The Flagellants left behind a legacy of religious fervor, radicalism, and a deep mistrust of the established Church. They served as a reminder of the fear and confusion that gripped Europe during the Black Death, a time when the boundaries between devotion and madness were blurred, and people were willing to go to extreme lengths to find answers in a world that had been turned upside down. So, as the shadows of the medieval world draw in and the flickering light fades, we can reflect on the disturbing rise of the flagellant cults, their bloody marches, their defiant chants, their self-inflicted punishments. These are the images that remain from a time when fear, disease, and the quest for salvation led people to take radical action. They were a sign of desperation, but also of a deep and unrelenting faith that, in the end, found its expression in the most disturbing of ways. As we continue to explore the rise of flagellant cults during the plague, let's dive into the cultural aftermath of their disturbing practices and how they left an indelible mark on medieval Europe. These groups, though formally suppressed, had a profound impact on the way religious movements would evolve in the years that followed. The Flagellants, though now largely erased from the annals of formal history, left a lasting imprint on how devotion, guilt, and penance would be viewed in both religious and social contexts. After the papal condemnation in 1349, the flagellant movement began to slowly dissipate. But by no means did the practices and ideas they promoted vanish completely. The idea that suffering could bring about redemption or end the plague didn't fade easily. People, particularly in rural areas, still turned to extreme forms of religious devotion as a way of making sense of the horror that surrounded them. The flagellant's image of self-purification and penance continued to linger in the minds of the people, especially in the form of local processions and acts of collective penance. The key idea that the flagellants propagated was that personal suffering could heal the world, a concept that resonated deeply in a time when the Black Death had turned every aspect of daily life into a battle for survival. For many, the plague was a divine punishment, and in their minds, Only through extreme actions like whipping and other forms of bodily sacrifice could they hope to secure God's mercy. These ideas, rooted in extreme devotion, slowly seeped into other religious practices in the aftermath of the Black Death. Flagellant-like rituals began to appear in various Christian traditions, especially in the form of public processions during the years that followed. These new processions were not as extreme as the original flagellants, but they still had elements of collective penance groups of people walking the streets, praying, and sometimes engaging in self-flagellation or other forms of mortification. These processions acted as a form of atonement for sin and a means of pleading for divine intervention during times of crisis. In this way, the flagellants had unknowingly seeded a broader cultural practice that would influence medieval Christianity. The idea that bodily suffering could purify the soul or protect the community from misfortune would find expression in later Catholic practices, especially during times of great social unrest or plague outbreaks, though the flagellant movement was officially condemned. Its impact on religious thought continued to resonate for centuries. The most fascinating aspect of the flagellant movement's legacy is how it reflected the profound psychological impact of the Black Death. The plague was a time of collective trauma, a moment in history when society was forced to confront death on an unimaginable scale. The flagellants' self-flagellation and their belief that they could stave off divine wrath through their suffering were responses to that trauma for those who joined the flagellant ranks. The act of physical pain was a way to regain control over a world spiraling into chaos. The Black Death had taken more than just lives. It had also stripped away the security and structure of the medieval world. People no longer trusted in their leaders, in the church, or in the old ways of life. The flagellants offered a new form of resistance, a way to take power back into their own hands through ritualized suffering. This could be seen as an act of rebellion, not just against the plague, but against a world that had failed them. However, despite the widespread appeal of the flagellants and their radical message, the Church's reaction was swift and decisive. The Pope's condemnation was not just a political move, it was a matter of survival for the Catholic Church, which viewed the flagellants as a threat to its own authority. The Church had long controlled the means of salvation, and here, in the wake of the plague, a movement was growing that threatened to undermine that control. The flagellants were seen as rogue religious zealots who acted outside the boundaries of sanctioned church doctrine. In 1349, Pope Clement VI excommunicated the flagellants, declaring them heretics. He issued a decree forbidding anyone from participating in their rituals. The Church's opposition to the movement, however, did not immediately extinguish it. The flagellant cults continued to exist in some form, especially in parts of Europe where the Black Death had caused the most devastation. The movement's power was most pronounced in the lowland regions, including Germany and parts of Italy, where it was deeply intertwined with local responses to the plague. Despite the Church's official ban on the flagellants, there were instances of them continuing their practices in secret in some rural areas. The movement persisted as a form of resistance against the Church's dominance. Many people felt the Church was out of touch with the suffering of the masses, and the flagellants gave them an alternative means of seeking salvation for these communities. Joining the flagellant processions offered a sense of solidarity. It was an act of community in the face of overwhelming despair. The flagellants promised an end to suffering through collective action, and even though their methods were extreme, they provided something that the Church could not: a sense of empowerment in the face of death. By the time the flagellant movement had begun to recede, it had already left a legacy of both spiritual and social significance. The idea of suffering for a cause as great as salvation or community redemption had taken root in the minds of many. It wasn't just a temporary escape for those who participated. It became a part of the cultural and religious fabric of medieval Europe. It influenced how people approached crises and death, marking the beginning of a more extreme form of religious devotion that would resurface in later centuries. So, as the night settles in and the shadows grow long, Remember the flagellants not just for their brutal acts of penance, but for their unsettling influence on religious movements throughout history. Their legacy is a stark reminder of how fear, in its most primal form, can shape the spiritual and social landscapes of entire civilizations. As we continue our exploration of the flagellant movement and its disturbing rise during the Black Death, let's take a step back and consider the broader implications of such extreme religious fervor on European society. The movement, though condemned and suppressed by the Church, left behind a legacy that would not easily fade. The fear, grief, and hopelessness of the Black Death had unleashed something deep within the human psyche, something that would forever shape religious practices in the centuries to come. For the flagellants, their self-inflicted suffering was more than just an act of penance. It was a symbolic rejection of the world as it was. Their brutal marches through European streets were as much a protest as they were a plea for mercy from a wrathful God. To them, the plague was not just a disease, it was divine punishment, a sign that humanity's sins had reached their limit. They believed that through their suffering, they could atone for the sins of the world, and thus bring an end to the plague. But as we reflect on their actions, one question remains: did they truly believe that by beating their bodies, they could rid the world of disease and despair? Or was their suffering simply an outlet for a grief-stricken, terror-stricken world that had no other way to cope with the widespread devastation? The flagellants' rise was as much a reflection of the chaos of the time as it was an attempt to regain control in a world turned upside down. Their actions were a desperate cry for meaning in the face of overwhelming death. After the Black Death, the very fabric of society had been torn apart, leaving people searching for any possible explanation for the plague. The flagellants provided an answer, but it was an answer that came at a terrible cost. Their rituals were not just physically painful, they were mentally and emotionally exhausting, plunging their participants deeper into a world where salvation could only be attained through suffering. Yet, despite their condemnation by the Church, the flagellants' legacy lived on. The idea of bodily penance, of seeking redemption through suffering, would have a lasting impact on later religious movements. The belief that physical suffering could purify the soul would be adopted in various forms by later mystics, ascetics, and even some Protestant reformers. It's fascinating, then, to consider how this strange, extreme form of devotion influenced the course of religious history in the centuries to come. As the Church cracked down on the flagellant movement, banning their practices and condemning their heretical beliefs, many of the flagellants disappeared from public view, at least in their most extreme forms. But the tension between the Church and the flagellants reflected a deeper, unresolved conflict within medieval Europe, the growing sense of distrust and alienation from the religious establishment. The Black Death, for all its horrors, had shaken the foundations of medieval society, exposing the fragility of the Church's control over the people. The flagellants were, in many ways, the embodiment of this growing dissent. They were not merely responding to the plague, they were rejecting the very structures that had, in their eyes, failed to protect them. In a world where the Church had long been the ultimate authority on life, death, and salvation, the flagellants offered an alternative, a radically different way to approach the idea of repentance in the aftermath of the Black Death. As Europe began to rebuild, the influence of the flagellants continued to echo. While the most extreme forms of their movement faded away, the psychological and spiritual impact of their practices endured. The idea that suffering could bring salvation did not disappear. It found expression in other, less extreme forms of religious devotion. Some saw it in the growing emphasis on personal piety and devotion, others in the rise of ascetic practices that focused on self-denial. The cultural and religious effects of the Flagellant movement can also be seen in the development of later Christian mysticism. The idea that the physical body could be used as a tool for spiritual purification continued to influence religious thought. even in the wake of the Church's condemnation of the flagellants. The belief that human suffering could have redemptive power remained a theme in religious discussions for centuries to come. By the time the 15th century arrived, the flagellants were largely forgotten in their extreme form, but the underlying themes they had introduced, suffering as a path to salvation, rejection of the Church's authority, and radical religious reform, would continue to surface in different ways. These ideas would play a role in the Protestant Reformation, when reformers like Martin Luther would challenge the Catholic Church's practices and teachings. So, as you lie back and think about the strange, disturbing rise of the flagellant cults, remember that their story is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a window into the human psyche, a reflection of how fear, grief, and desperation can drive people to the most extreme forms of belief. The flagellants, with their painful rituals and their desperate cries for redemption, were not just a product of their time, they were a product of human nature itself. Grappling with the most fundamental questions of existence. What is the purpose of suffering? How do we make sense of the pain and loss in our lives? And can we find redemption through suffering? The legacy of the flagellants is unsettling. Yes, but it's also deeply human. It's a story of a people driven by fear and hope, seeking meaning in a world that had been shattered by disaster. Their practices may have been extreme, but their desperation was not. It was a desperation that echoes through history, and one that we continue to grapple with in different forms, even today, as we continue exploring the lingering effects of the flagellant cults. We now turn our attention to the cultural and spiritual consequences that spread throughout medieval Europe. Even long after the Black Death began to subside, the legacy of the flagellants, though officially condemned by the Church, continued to reverberate throughout society. Their extreme acts of devotion and their rejection of the Church's authority had sown seeds that would bear fruit in surprising ways in the centuries that followed. At the heart of the flagellant movement was an overwhelming sense of guilt, a belief that the plague was a divine punishment for humanity's sins. This worldview, born out of fear and suffering, left a deep mark on the collective psyche of the people. The flagellants, with their bloody processions and self-inflicted punishment, had created a new form of religious devotion, one that emphasized personal suffering as a path to salvation. But what happened to these ideas once the flagellant cults were suppressed by the Church, after the flagellants were officially condemned? The movement, in its most extreme form, began to fade. But the concept of self-inflicted suffering for religious purposes did not vanish completely. In the years that followed, elements of flagellant ideology found their way into new religious movements and spiritual practices. Though the acts of public flogging and marching through the streets disappeared, the idea that suffering could bring salvation or spiritual growth persisted in the form of asceticism practices where individuals withdrew from worldly pleasures in order to devote themselves entirely to God. The flagellants had given birth to a new religious fervor, one that placed an emphasis on personal penance, inner purification, and a deep sense of guilt. This idea spread beyond the boundaries of the medieval Church and found its way into various monastic traditions across Europe. The practice of flagellation itself, though not as extreme as it had been during the height of the Black Death, persisted in the rituals of some religious communities. In fact, many religious orders, particularly those focused on asceticism and self-discipline, adopted some form of corporal punishment as a means of spiritual purification. But as the centuries passed, these practices became less about the need to ward off plague and more about a search for personal holiness, self-control, and an attempt to replicate the flagellants' extreme devotion. The remnants of the flagellant movement, though stripped of its more disturbing rituals, continued to shape the way people thought about sin, suffering, and salvation. One of the most striking ways the flagellant legacy endured was in the rise of later mystic movements, particularly during the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther though rejecting the practices of the flagellants, found themselves grappling with many of the same questions about human suffering and salvation. The idea that personal penance was necessary for forgiveness, a concept at the heart of the flagellant cults, had been deeply embedded in the religious consciousness of Europe. Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church's teachings about indulgences can be seen as a reaction to the extreme practices of the flagellants. The Catholic Church, for centuries, had preached that through acts of penance, indulgences, and suffering, one could earn salvation. The flagellants took this to its most extreme end, whipping themselves in the streets as an act of devotion to save themselves from the plague. Luther, while rejecting these ideas, still acknowledged the role of personal faith and repentance, albeit in a more internalized, less physical way. The legacy of the flagellants, in this sense, can be seen as a precursor to the intense religious devotion that would characterize the Reformation. Even if the methods were radically different, however, the impact of the flagellants wasn't limited to religious reform, it also had cultural ramifications. The extreme acts of devotion and the visual spectacle of the flagellant processions would influence art, literature, and folklore for generations. The image of men and women walking through the streets, whipping themselves as a form of atonement, became a haunting symbol in European consciousness. It was a symbol of both the human desire for redemption and the terrifying fear of divine wrath. In art, depictions of the flagellants were often used to illustrate themes of suffering, penance, and the moral consequences of sin. These depictions would resonate with a society that had experienced the horrors of the Black Death, where death was no longer an abstract concept, but a real, ever-present force. The visual imagery of the flagellants would continue to appear in religious art and literature, particularly in works dealing with the nature of sin and punishment. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the flagellant movement was how it shaped the way Europeans understood their relationship to the divine. The flagellants had introduced a new way of approaching suffering, not as a punishment to be avoided, but as a necessary step towards salvation. This idea would continue to influence religious thought for centuries. In the years after the Black Death, religious communities began to develop new ways of addressing the problem of sin. The notion that suffering could be a means of purging sin remained central to many monastic orders and mystic movements. This continued belief in the redemptive power of suffering would eventually find expression in the more extreme acts of devotion seen in later centuries, including practices such as self-flagellation, pilgrimage, and other forms of asceticism. As the centuries passed, the flagellant cults faded into history, but their legacy, both in terms of religious practices and cultural symbolism, remained. The idea that suffering could lead to salvation, that physical pain could bring spiritual purification, continued to resonate with generations of people living through times of plague, war, and uncertainty. The flagellants, in their own way, had forever changed the way that Europeans thought about faith, suffering, and redemption. So, as you settle in tonight, think about the strange and unsettling rise of the flagellant cults. Their legacy reminds us of the extreme lengths to which people will go in times of fear and despair. Their self-inflicted suffering was not just about penance, it was about survival, about trying to make sense of a world that had been torn apart by disease and death. In the end, the flagellants were not just a footnote in history, they were a symbol of how deeply faith and fear can intertwine. As we continue to reflect on the unsettling rise of the flagellant cults, we come to an understanding of how deeply they shaped the medieval worldview. The Black Death, which brought about untold suffering, not only altered the physical landscape of Europe, but also left a profound mark on the collective psyche of its people. In times of unimaginable grief and loss, many turned to extreme forms of religious devotion, believing that only through intense penance could they appease God and put an end to the horrors they were facing. And it was in these circumstances that the flagellant movement found its fertile ground. As we explore further, It's important to consider how the flagellants' practices were rooted not just in fear of the plague, but also in the larger religious and philosophical questions that arose during times of crisis. The Black Death forced people to confront their own mortality and the possibility that their entire way of life had been in some way inadequate or sinful. The idea that suffering could redeem sin became intertwined with the notion of collective responsibility, a belief that everyone shared in the sin of the world and must therefore suffer together to atone. The flagellants' belief in collective suffering was particularly striking because it embodied the idea of the community coming together to confront divine wrath. Unlike more individualistic religious practices, the flagellant movement was a group effort, an act of mass penance where entire towns would participate in the rituals. In their eyes, the plague was not just an individual's punishment, but the collective punishment of all of humanity. And so, it was through group acts of penance that they hoped to save not only themselves, but their communities. In this sense, the flagellants represented a radical shift in the way religion was practiced, whereas traditional Catholicism emphasized personal confession and penance. The flagellants introduced a form of public, collective penance. Their processions, filled with self-inflicted suffering, became symbolic acts of shared responsibility, where every participant, in bleeding and chanting, was performing an act of communal redemption. The rise of these radical religious movements embodied by the flagellants also exposed a deep fracture in the relationship between the people and the church. The flagellants were, in many ways, a form of protest against what was perceived as the failure of the church to protect the people from the plague. In a world where the church held immense power and was seen as the intermediary between God and man, many began to question its ability to offer salvation. The growing disillusionment with the clergy gave rise to these alternative forms of devotion, where the people felt they could take matters into their own hands. This movement, though extreme, was not just about religious devotion, it was a direct challenge to the established religious authorities. The fact that the church had to intervene so aggressively to suppress the flagellants speaks to the perceived threat they posed. The Pope and bishops saw these self-appointed penitents as undermining the authority of the church, and their unregulated practices posed a risk to the church's control over the faithful. The church's condemnation of the flagellants wasn't merely about religious orthodoxy, it was about maintaining control over spiritual practices, ensuring that only the church could define the path to salvation, despite the church's attempts to suppress the movement. The legacy of the flagellants lingered long after their official decline. The practice of penance and self-mortification, although not as extreme, continued to play a role in religious life throughout medieval Europe. This fascination with physical suffering as a means of spiritual purification continued to influence later Christian movements, especially those focused on mysticism and asceticism in the centuries that followed. The Church's increasing focus on personal salvation and confession shifted the way many approached penance. The extreme practices of the flagellants gave way to more individualized forms of religious devotion, but the idea that suffering could cleanse the soul remained prevalent. Some mystics, particularly in the late Middle Ages and during the early Renaissance, saw in suffering a closer connection to God. They believed that, just as Christ suffered on the cross, they too could purify themselves through physical pain. In more recent history, the legacy of the flagellants can still be seen in some of the more extreme religious practices across the world. The idea that suffering can bring people closer to God has been adopted by certain religious groups throughout time. While these practices are far removed from the medieval flagellants, the roots of these beliefs born in the wake of the Black Death continue to shape spiritual traditions today. Interestingly, the flagellants movement also has echoes in secular society. Their extreme acts of devotion were, in some ways, an expression of the human need to regain control in times of utter despair. It speaks to a fundamental part of the human experience, the desire to find meaning in suffering. The flagellants were not just trying to survive the plague, they were trying to make sense of the suffering that surrounded them. in a world that felt chaotic and beyond understanding. They turned to the only thing that seemed certain, the idea that through their pain, they could restore balance and hope to the world. So, as you settle in tonight, think about the legacy of the Flagellants. Their strange, extreme practices may seem distant, but the desperation that fueled their actions is something deeply human. They were trying to make sense of a world that had gone mad with fear, loss, and grief, and in their suffering. They believed they could find redemption, not just for themselves, but for the world. The Flagellants, in their painful and disturbing way, remind us of the lengths to which people will go when they are faced with tragedy and uncertainty. Their story is a reminder of how fear and hope can push the human spirit to its breaking point and, in some cases, beyond. As we continue to reflect on the disturbing rise of the flagellant cults, we now take a moment to consider the broader implications of their legacy, not just for religious practices, but for society as a whole. The Flagellants, though eventually suppressed by the Church, left a deep imprint on the way people thought about suffering, faith, and redemption. Their rise during the Black Death was a moment of profound crisis, but it also marked the beginning of a new way of approaching spiritual devotion in times of despair, despite the Church's condemnation. The idea that physical suffering could lead to spiritual purification did not disappear entirely in the centuries that followed. Elements of flagellant-like practices could be seen in various religious movements, both within and outside of Catholicism. The idea that the body could be used as a tool for spiritual cleansing found its way into ascetic practices, mysticism, and even the early Protestant movements. The Flagellants, in their extreme devotion, had set a precedent for the idea that suffering was not just inevitable, it was redemptive, as we explore the influence of the Flagellants on later religious thought. We find that their legacy was not only about their practice of physical penance, but also about their challenge to the established religious order, the Flagellants. In rejecting the Church's role as the sole mediator between humanity and God, represented a form of protest. They believed that the Church had failed to protect them from the plague, and that only through their own actions could they restore order and bring an end to the suffering. In this way, their actions were not just a form of personal atonement, they were a direct challenge to the religious authority of the time. The Flagellants' belief in the need for personal sacrifice was deeply unsettling to the Church, which had long held the monopoly on religious salvation. The idea that people could take matters into their own hands, that they could be their own agents of redemption, undermined the very structure that the Church had spent centuries building. This direct challenge to the authority of the Church is one of the most significant aspects of the flagellant movement. Even if it was not fully recognized at the time, while the Flagellants may have faded from view after the Church's intervention, their influence remained in the cultural consciousness. The idea of public penance, of collective suffering, would appear again throughout European history, especially during times of crisis. During the Reformation, for example, Protestant reformers would take up the idea of personal faith and rejection of church authority, even though they did not practice the same extreme forms of penance. The Flagellants, in their rejection of the Church's authority and their radical approach to salvation, played a role in the broader religious shifts that would shape the future of Europe. In the centuries after the Black Death, the Flagellants' legacy would continue to influence religious movements and the way people thought about suffering. The notion that physical pain could lead to spiritual purification would find expression in the mystic traditions of the Middle Ages, in the ascetic practices of certain monastic orders, and even in the more extreme expressions of faith seen in some Protestant groups. These ideas, rooted in the flagellant movement, would persist, sometimes in hidden corners of society, but always in the background of European religious life. Even today, we can see echoes of the flagellant movement in various forms of religious devotion that emphasize personal suffering as a means of spiritual growth. while the extreme acts of self-punishment may have faded. The underlying belief that suffering can lead to redemption still resonates in some religious practices. The Flagellants, in their desperate attempts to cleanse the world of sin, left behind a legacy that continued to influence not only religious thought, but also the ways in which people process suffering and grief. Their legacy is also present in the stories we tell about the past, in the way we look back at the plague and the people who tried to make sense of it. The Flagellants were not just a footnote in history, they were part of a larger narrative about the human need for meaning in times of crisis. Their actions were extreme, but they were driven by a deeply human desire to find order in the midst of chaos, as you lie back and let the quiet of the night wash over you. Think about the Flagellants once more, not just as strange and disturbing figures, but as a reminder of how far humanity will go when faced with fear, death, and the unknown. The rise of the flagellant cults is a story of desperation and faith, of rebellion and redemption. It's a story that still resonates today, reminding us that in times of crisis, people will always seek ways to cope, to understand, and to survive even if it means resorting to extreme measures. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember the legacy of the Flagellants not just as a distant and unsettling chapter of history, but as a reminder of the depths of human belief and the lengths we will go to find meaning in a world filled with suffering.